it is important to have balance because only by having that balance will those long flowing sentences or those short punchy sentences have any impact. If the whole book is punchy sentences, it's going to be really stressful to read the whole thing. You need to have that balance so that you can appreciate it when you do have those moments.
Right. Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. My name is Savannah Gilbo, and I'm here to help you write a story that works. I want to prove to you that writing a novel doesn't have to be overwhelming. So each week, I'll bring you a brand new episode with simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing right away. So whether you're brand new to writing or more of a seasoned author looking to improve your craft, this podcast is for you. So pick up a pen and let's get started. In today's episode, we're going to talk about mood and tone, specifically how to utilize mood and tone in your writing. And my guest today will be sharing 4 ways you can evoke or express mood and tone, as well as some things to think about when it comes to mood and tone. Her name is Isobelle Lans, and she's a UK-based author, editor, writing coach, and website designer who runs a business called Inspired Creative Co. And she's all about helping writers at all levels grow, learn, and develop their storytelling skills through personalized coaching and solutions-based feedback. I will put all the links to where you can find Isobelle around the internet in the show notes. But for now, let's dig into my conversation with Isobelle Lans that's all about tone and mood. Hi, Isobelle. Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, and I gave you a little introduction already, but can you just tell my audience in your own words who you are, what you do, and things like that?
Absolutely. So I'm Isobelle Lans. I am an editor, writing coach, and website designer at Inspired Creative Co. And I've been running my business since 2019, been editing for years before then, both in-house and freelance. And I'm also a writer of fiction as well. At the moment, very heavily thriller and mystery, but before that, it was fantasy.
That's pretty cool. A little genre switcheroo. I like that. So, Isobelle, if it's okay with you, I kind of want to just dive right into it. So let's start with what are tone and mood, and how do you go about describing this to the writers that you work with?
So tone and mood refer to the kind of atmosphere that you're creating and the feel within the writing. So these are things like the word choices and your style of writing, and essentially the feeling that that reader is getting.
Yes. And that's how I like to think about it too. So tone is kind of like how you feel and what you're putting into the project and how you're writing things, the sentences and things like that. And then that helps to create the mood, which is how your reader receives it on the other end. And, with the writers I work with, I see it almost feels like there's a lot of mystery around these things, or it's like a nebulous thing. How do we create tone and mood and things like that? And I know we're going to talk about that, but if I'm a brand new writer and I'm like, okay, I see what you're saying, but why should I care about this? Why is it important? What would you say?
So it's important for being able to say exactly how that reader should be receiving your work. So in crime and thriller, you obviously want them to be nervous and be tense and kind of be gripped by what's happening in the book. And if you're not setting the right tone and the right kind of atmosphere in that story, then they're not going to be receiving it in the way that you want, which means that it's probably not going to have the impact that you want.
Right. And I saw a real life example of this last week. I was on some live summit and they were talking about, I got agent feedback and the agent said, how you're writing or the tone of your work doesn't match your genre. And this person said, well, I'm writing kind of a romance and there's also a subplot with a crime. And I said, okay, well, so what tone do you think your story had? And they were like, well, I think it's romantic suspense. Like it was really tense. And I'm like, well, then you're not probably writing a straight romance, right? Like, so it is very important. And I do see agents on the other end and even readers who, when there's that disconnect between what the story's about or what they know about the author and the tone, it's just jarring, right? It's not a good experience.
Yeah. And it can be really hard as well if there's a genre crossover. And romance and suspense is definitely a tricky one to put together because they're 2 very different things.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to how you're going to market it, right? Because if you're marketing it as a romance and there happens to be like small beach town mystery inside that romance, you're still going for the romantic feeling of the book, that happily ever after and things like that. If you market it as a romantic suspense, then we at least know we're getting some of that, mood and that tense feeling, right? But So it comes down to marketing. It comes down to, before that, even knowing what you want to convey. So really, really important. But you talk about 4 things that we can look at or think about when we're trying to utilize tone and mood in our stories. Do you want to go through those?
Yeah. So the first one, which I think is, depending on your style of writing, it could just come out so naturally that you don't even realize you're doing it, is through using really specific language. So this is where you can really dig into that character's voice. And then by having that character's voice, you can really set the tone of the story. So let's say you're writing that summer beach read romance. Your character is probably going to be someone who is quite lighthearted and fun and bubbly, and it's just a real feel-good book, which means that the kind of language they're going to be using is going to reflect that. So you might have something like, the cool wind kissed the back of her neck. Whereas if you're writing a crime and it was this like down on his luck, pessimistic cop, then he'd probably say something like, a cool wind nipped at the back of his neck, like the eager hands of death to try and clean him. It's a very different feel.
Big difference. Yeah. I love that. And so I think, like you said, sometimes I work with writers where it comes out so naturally, they don't even know they're doing it. And the funny thing is, usually once they're done, they're like, okay, so now I need to go worry about tone and mood and voice. And I'm like, you've already nailed it and you didn't even know you were doing it. So sometimes it comes out naturally. Other times it is something we have to think about. And I know within the next kind of 3 things we're going to talk about, you're going to give us ideas for how we can think about the language we use. But yeah, I think it's kind of like the one we all see the most is the language and what's on the page, right? But what's the second thing?
So internal monologue. And this is one of my favorite things to read and to write. It's just such a secret weapon for writers. And you can really play with that juxtaposition of what a character says versus what they think and feel. So if your character's being invited to some party, they might say, wow, it sounds amazing. I can't wait for it. And in their head, they're thinking this weekend is going to be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
And you're already setting up an expectation or setting up a field for not only just who the character is, but an expectation of where the story might be going, what we can expect, and how we should feel, because your characters really inform the reader how to feel.
Right. And, I love that too, because it's kind of showing that things aren't as they seem, maybe on the surface. And so it gets our brains working the way that they need to work, which is there's something going on here, pay attention. Whereas compared to something like, a middle grade fantasy where sometimes it can be a little dark, but most of the time it's like wonder and fun and humor and just keeping us kind of on that track. Or in something like a contemporary romance, it's like the interiority matches kind of the vibe of the genre you're writing for, right? So I love that interiority, the inner monologue. I think that's also, I agree with you. You said it's our superpower. It's what sets writing novels apart from TV and things like that. So huge benefit to digging into that. And then what's the third thing we can look at?
So the third is setting. And sometimes this can be so easily overlooked. And certainly if you're writing a crime thriller that might be set in modern day London or something like that, you're kind of like, it's London, everyone knows what that's about, or New York, or anywhere, we kind of know to expect. But you want to make sure that your setting is playing into that tone and that feel that you want to create. So in the case of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which is my favorite book, its setting plays such a huge part because it's remote, it's on an island, and then not only that, but then there's a massive storm. And already it creates this like suffocating intensity that makes everything that happens in the book so much harder for the characters. And it really sets up the plot then because there's a storm and they're isolated, and it plays into that tension and all of that. Yeah. So if you're writing a crime thriller or you're writing any genre, it's really important that that setting is reflecting the tone and the mood and benefiting the plot.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's one of those things, again, that like we see and we can envision. If we're writing horror, yes, the setting plays into it and things like that. But also it totally matters for every genre, right? Like in a bubbly romance, we want to pay attention to like, how can we enhance the reader's experience and give them those feelings of love? And in something else, like a thriller crime story, it's how do we kind of up that tension? And I think it's really cool just thinking about all these things so far, the different levers we can pull to give the reader a certain experience. And like you said in the beginning, some of these things come more naturally to certain writers. I don't know any writer who nails all four of these things in their first, however many drafts, but we can all learn and we can all get there, which I think is really cool. So far we said language, that interiority or that inner monologue, the setting. What's the fourth thing?
So the fourth one is through sentence structure. And this is different to that first point about the actual words that you're using, because this is playing with tension instead. So you've got the difference between those short, snappy sentences and those long, flowing sentences and how they make you feel. So I've got some examples. A short, like tense, urgent sentence could be, I run down the hallway, bang, the gunshot sings through the air. I turn the corner, bang, the bullet lodges in the wall. Like you really feel like you're there, and it's panic and it's high stakes, and you the sentences almost mirror a heartbeat of
Right.
and bang, these things are happening.
Yeah, it's punchy.
Yeah. And then you've got these long flowing sentences that are more relaxed and a bit calm and make the reader feel a bit more at ease. So something like, I nestle into his embrace, feeling the warmth of his body, the beat of his heart, the rise of the chest, and I know that every wound I've ever had can now begin to heal.
Yeah.
And having that there's that long, almost repetition of this feeling, it's kind of like a hug, you're still really safe in it, but you wouldn't feel that if it was those short, sharp sentences.
Right. Yeah. Just even hearing you read it, it's a totally different experience. So that's very cool. And then something that I see a lot with the writers I work with or that are in my course, they'll sometimes think that like they have to fully lean in one way or the other. So in the example you use, let's say that I'm writing a romance and when I hear you read that, I'm like, yes, that last sentence is what I want to do. They'll sometimes take that to mean like that's what the whole draft needs to be and I can't use punchy sentences. What are your thoughts on that?
I fully appreciate the thought behind it, but it is important to have balance, because only by having that balance will those long flowing sentences or those short punchy sentences have any impact. Right? If the whole book is punchy sentences, it's going to be really stressful to read the whole thing. You need to have that balance so that you can appreciate it when you do have those moments.
Right. Yeah. And so I always tell them that kind of the same thing. Like when you're reading a book, you feel the sentences and the times that you're meant to feel. And if everything else was like that, those would not stand out and it wouldn't be that experience. So, I'm guilty of this too as a writer. Like sometimes I take advice as super black and white and I'm like, I have to do X because that's what I read. Right. And it's usually like, no, everything's a balance. So it's a balance of all four of these things: language, that inner monologue or interiority, the setting, the sentence structure, and then everything else, of course, right? Like your character development, everything, your plot. But if I'm listening to this, I might be wondering, okay, I get it. There's four things I can dig into. I know what tone and mood are. I might be wondering, when should I worry about this? Is this like a first draft problem? Is this something I do when I'm at the last editing phase? Like, when do I worry about it?
I mean, it's always good to have in mind. And, the cleaner first draft you write, then the easier it is to revise. But I would never put the pressure on a writer to get it right the first time round, because you don't always know the story that you're trying to tell the first time around. And you don't know that that's what that scene necessarily needs, or that the first time you wrote it was the best way to write it. So I think really it's revisions. That's where that real magic happens.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's like you said, sometimes you might surprise yourself. You might not think I have a writer who's like this. She's like, I'm not that funny. Like, I don't think I could ever write a romantic comedy. And then the draft she produces, I'm like, you're actually pretty funny. Like it's hard to see or that about yourself or know what's going to come out of you until you actually write something down. So what I like to do, and tell me if you agree or disagree, but I like to at least think through these things. Like, what kind of mood do I want? Do I want humor? What kind of, or do I not? Like, do I want to feel darker or more romantic? And then like, how do I feel about what I'm writing too? Because that's going to color things. So just thinking through it, and you don't have to make a decision, but it's just like, I know I want something like this or something not like this, and then you can at least get a jump start on your draft. And then, like you said, focus on it more in revisions.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that our characters just surprise us and they really lead the way, because I wrote a crime thriller recently and I didn't really know what any of the voices would be. I had, I think, 7 perspectives. And they also praised me because they're like, cool, this is my voice. This is how I feel about things. And it was really fun to just be like, cool, lead the way.
Yeah. You're like, I'm glad you've done all the heavy lifting here. I love it. And speaking of voice, that's something else that writers really struggle with. I think just because they haven't, I don't know, researched it or experienced it, they think it's going to be something really complicated. So what, on that note of like having to write so many perspectives and voices, are there any tips you have around that or any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I would say that, so for me, I'm a pantser and I don't like to plot too much in advance, but if you are a plotter, then definitely considering how your characters differ, because you don't want them obviously all to be the same. Mm-hmm. So in my crime thriller, I had some characters who were very emotionally detached and were kind of almost indifferent when there was a dead body, and then other characters who were borderline hysterical. And it creates that balance then that kind of encompasses the reality of what you would have if you had 10 random people in a room. Yeah. And then thinking about the voice that would match that. So if they're really detached emotionally, what kind of voice are they going to have? Are they going to be really snarky? Are they going to be completely blunt and indifferent? Yeah. So I guess working on that personality.
Yeah. And I think that's the key, is doing all that character work, because with the detached people, it's like, why are they detached? What happened in their backstory? What do they value? What do they not value? And then how does that color kind of how they show up? And it's almost like just by doing that work, you normally will get to a voice. And kind of like you said, the characters led the way, right? And of course, you can sharpen that and stuff like that. But sometimes I feel like writers put so much pressure on voice because we hear agents want a good voice and things like that. And it's almost like if you just do the character work and you write something, get it down, it'll come out. Do you think that that's kind of what happened to you?
Oh, completely. Yeah. I never know what my stories are going.
Yeah. Well, and I'm a plotter, and I work with a lot of writers who are plotters. And even if we think we do, there's still surprises, especially when it comes to character. So, we can't ever plan everything 100%. I wish we could. But okay, so back to tone and mood. Are there any mistakes you see that are like common pitfalls people make with the writers you work with and things like that?
I think largely it would be what you were saying earlier about the fact that they don't quite know what the way needs to be. And I think there can be some disconnect between who the character is and then the kind of story that you're writing. So if you've got like a really bitter protagonist to a romance, it's already a very different feeling.
Right.
And so I think trying to think about exactly where your story fits in the genre and exactly how you can differentiate them and sort of make your voice stand out, I guess. Yeah. But still encompassing I don't want to use the word that started, but the overall vibe of the book. And I think that really comes into the things like word usage and how you want the reader to perceive what's happening in the book.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of those hard things about writing, because you do have to adopt multiple perspectives. Like you have to be you, the author, and you know what you want to have happen in your book. Then you have to adopt your characters' perspectives and like develop them and think about what they would do. And then at some point you do need to zoom out and be like, what's the reader going to think of this and how do I want them to feel? And, it's really hard to hold all three of those perspectives at once, which is why we have planning if you're a planner, and we have the writing process and then the revision process and all that, right? But yeah, I think even like to use your example, you said a romance with someone who's kind of bitter. You can totally do that if you want, just do it with intention, right? Or do it knowing that that's the effect you're going to have. And then, think about how that's going to be received in your genre and things like that. It's not like we're saying, at least correct me if I'm wrong, Isobelle, but it's not like we're saying if you write romance, it has to be a bubbly tone and mood. We're not saying that. It's just, we're using examples, and then we want you to think about it and make informed decisions and deliberate choices about how you wield these tools.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, everything in our writing needs to be intentional. There has to be an actual reason behind anything that we do.
Yeah, including 7 point of views.
Yes.
I love it. People are going to hear that and be like, holy cow, 7 point of views. That's like, usually people are like, I want to do 4 or 5, and you just knock them out of the park with 7. I love it.
I didn't say I did them well.
Yeah. I guess the readers will see. Time will tell, right? But that's still like an ambitious thing to tackle. I love it. So I know you have a PDF download for listeners. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So I have a little freebie that is 10 ways to enhance your storytelling. So over the years as an editor and writing coach, I've compiled all of these different things that I see writers struggling with, especially in those early stages of their writing career. So if you struggle with things like showing and telling or pacing, that's going to be in the workbook and the mistakes that we've all made. So definitely.
Yeah, and it's kind of fun. I love roundups of common mistakes because it's like great to know when we're writing, but also it makes us feel normal when we're like, yeah, we've made 8 out of 10 of these mistakes, right? Very normal. We all do it. So we'll put the link to how you can grab that PDF workbook in the show notes. And then we'll also include where to find Isobelle around the internet. But do you want to just tell us like what your website is and your main social media?
Yeah, so I hang out on Instagram. I am at inspiredcreativeco_, and my website is inspiredcreativeco.com.
Love it. And then finally, Isobelle, is there any like last parting words of wisdom or anything top of mind that you want to share with listeners?
I think as age-old advice, but just read, just devour books and try and assess what those authors are doing. Keep these 4 points in mind and go through your favorite book and see what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's also a great way to find out what you don't like too, right? So if you're hearing Isobelle talk about the short, snappy sentences versus the long ones, and you read a book and you're like, I don't like the anxiety I feel when there's too many short, snappy sentences, that's great info too. So read to find out what you do like, what you don't like, where your book fits in the market. And I hope that this conversation today with Isobelle helps us feel a little bit less overwhelmed with tone and mood, because I know they can be nebulous, but I think when wielded to our advantage, they can be really awesome tools. So thank you, Isobelle, for coming on the show today. I'm so glad to have you here. And like I mentioned earlier, we will post all the links to where writers can find you all around the internet in the show notes. But again, just thank you so much for taking the time to come and share your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and for showing your support. If you want to check out any of the links I mentioned in this episode, you can find them in the show notes listed in the description of each episode inside your podcast player or at savannahgilbo.com/podcast. If you're an Apple user, I'd really appreciate it if you took a few seconds to leave a rating and a review. Your ratings and reviews tell Apple that this is a podcast that's worth listening to. And in turn, your reviews will help this podcast get in front of more fiction writers just like you. And while you're there, go ahead and hit that follow button because there's going to be another brand new episode next week full of actionable tips, tools, and strategies to help you become a better writer. So I'll see you next week, and until then, happy writing.